Alright, in this video tutorial we are going to play around with the gradient tool. So a gradient basically is just it's a gradation of one color to another, right? So in order to get started, let's make a rectangle and just draw the rectangle anywhere you want. Okay, so now with the gradient, we're going to open up a couple of windows. Okay, so we want to make sure that our appearance window is open because we're going to be playing around with that. We want to make sure our color window is open because we want to play with that, our gradient, and of course our properties. Okay, if you want to set up your application to look like mine, you'll go into the pull down menu right up here, and you'll pull that down and say Essentials. Okay, so that way everything will look right. Okay, so we have our properties, we have our layers, and those are the two palettes that we'll be using, the two windows. I like to stick these two together because they're both kind of long, and as your artwork starts to get more complex, your layers will move further and further down, right? So this way they kind of match each other in terms of their length. And then you could organize your windows any which way you want. I like to put my color stuff up on the top, and then I put my other stuff further down depending on what I'm using. Obviously, you can have a lot of windows open. All right, so we got our dude. I got a rectangle here, right? So now what we want to do is we want to add a gradient. There's two ways of doing that. One, there's this little gradient button right down here. You can click on that. It'll make it a gradient. If you want it to stop being your gradient, you just click on that. Okay, that's one way of doing it. The other way is to click the gradient tool right here, and that will do sort of the same thing, but it allows you to access the gradient window right here. Okay, it's probably better to use this option right here because it kind of automatically gives you the gradient right away. Now the gradient in and of itself, in this window here, you'll see that we've got a couple of different kinds of gradients. When you first launch the gradient window, it will be a linear and it'll be a black and white gradient. Okay, so there's not a whole lot you can do about that right away. We'll have to play around a little bit with that tool in a second. Let me show you how this little gradient tool works. We've got a little crayon on the left and a little crayon on the right, and these are our two colors. And so what'll happen is that if we double click on this, we'll see a gradient, and then we'll have a color picker, and we'll have swatches. But probably the most important thing is we have this little dial, this little menu right up here. If we click on that, we can pick different color models. So we pick RGB, we'll see colors. We have been using HSB, hue, saturation, brightness, so we'll continue to use that tool. It's a little bit more fun. Okay, so at the moment, our first color that we've selected right here is white. Okay, so what we want to do then is we want to sort of play around with something else. So we can click on the swatches just for starters, and so we can pick a color, any color, it doesn't really matter. And what will happen then is that we are now in a color environment that we can play around with the different colors. Okay, so if we double click on this, and we go back to our little palette, we now have colors that we can play with. And so we can pick any color that we want, and notice that the little crayon is changing color, right? Okay, so whatever color we pick, and again we can drag our sliders around and do whatever we want with that as well. Okay, so that's the way we control one color, and when we're done, you just click off it anywhere and then you're done. If you want to manipulate the second color, you do the same thing. You double click on it, and it will give us the black grayscale option to start with. We'll pick HSB and then click anywhere, and we will then get another color, right? And then we can monkey around with the different attributes of that color. Okay, we can also at any time play around with the opacity. The opacity essentially is, how much brightness you can see. I mean, how much of the thickness of the color, if you will. Okay, so we have some presets that we can immediately play around with. Okay, or if you hold your cursor over the number and you use your scroll wheel, you'll be able to just dynamically change that by just using that scroller. It's a pretty cool way of playing around with these different number values, and it pretty much works in anything. See what happens here. I can do the same thing here. I'm using my scroller wheel and I'm just changing those numbers, right? So kind of cool. All right. Just click off to close that window. Click anywhere. Okay, so now in my gradient, say for example, say I got what I want here. All right, so if I wanted to change that color, I could just double click on the crayon. You can also change where the color change occurs by this little diamond right here. Notice as I slide it over, it makes the green more condensed, and the red sort of spreads out, and the same thing occurs if I do the other way, right? So this is kind of cool, kind of fun. And then say I wanted to add a third color, or fourth or fifth or whatever. Say I wanted a color in the middle. Notice my cursor has changed to a little plus sign, right? Notice that as I move away, watch what happens. See, it turns to a plus sign. And anywhere in here, I can add another crayon. And so that crayon will, by default, pick up the middle color. But if I double click on it, I can pick another color. Boy, that's ugly. I always do that. I always pick these really ugly colors in demos. I don't know why. But that's how it works. And if you wanted to make that transparent, you could actually have that become transparent right in the middle with a little bit of that color gradating out, right? So there's some really fun and exciting things that you can do with this tool. And if you decide you don't want a color, you can simply just click on it and drag it off and it goes away. If you decide you wanted it back, undo it. Okay, so you can continue to add colors as far as you want. You can change the how much that color affects the gradient by pulling these little diamonds back and forth. So that's kind of fun. And so that's essentially the gradient tool. If you want to change the direction of the gradient, this is the direction, the angle tool. And again, you can just change that by scrolling until you get the gradient angle that you want. Okay. If you want the gradient to be smaller or larger, you can pull these little tools around. So by pulling that in, I can change the gradient. I can move the gradient. Okay, so this top one changes the intensity of the gradient. The bottom one moves it from place to place in the design. Okay, so that's how you manipulate a linear gradient. So we can also play around with radial gradients. Okay, and radial gradients are useful for circles, for example. So I'm going to click my V key to select my pointer tool, my selection tool. I'm going to just drag this out of the way a little bit and we leave it there. And then let's make a circle. So in our rectangle tool, we can click and then drag an ellipse down. And let's drag an ellipse. And it's going to basically give me this gradient that I've been using. And it's going to automatically apply it to a circle. So now what I can do is I can say here, where it says linear, I can click on this and say radial. Okay, so now what happens is that this radial gradient has the it looks like a radial gradient, right? So now if I wanted to manipulate that, I might click on this gradient tool controller. And then I can do the same thing, right? I can, although with the circle, you could do a lot of other things. Like say, for example, I can move that in, I can move it out. Okay, so it doesn't have to stay inside of the shape. And for the linear gradient, it's the same story. I can also change where it goes by pulling that other little dot. Okay, that's the dot on the outside. And then this dot allows me to move the whole thing around. Okay, so now say I wanted to make that look like there was a highlight on that, I could pull the little crayons down and open up the spacing a little bit, right? Can you see what's happening here? So these little crayons are essentially the same crayons that we have in the tool itself, and it'll allow us to change where the color goes in that gradient. Okay, so pull it out a little bit, pull it in a little bit, kind of make it a little bit more like it's picking up a highlight. If I wanted to change the color itself, I could, well, actually, what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of scaling it a little bit, right, to kind of make it kind of cool. And then I'm going to zoom out for a moment, and I'm going to click my V key to get back to this. And so those are the ways that you can play around with the radial gradient. And you can do the same thing. You can change its orientation by playing around with the lower one, which gives me kind of an eyeball idea, right? Or I can change its angle by playing around with that, right? So you can see how it's turning around while I'm playing around with that little tool there. All right, so that's the radial gradient tool. And, say, for example, we wanted to make it look like it was a shadow. We might do something like that. And so, and then when you're done, you just click off of that. Or alternatively, if you wanted to edit that color, you could say, oh, I'm going to make that transparent, and then, whoa, it goes away, right? So more fun than a barrel of monkeys. Okay, so that's really the gradient tools. And that's the functionality. So that's pretty much it for gradients. All right.